What avoidance hope for when you go no contact? Let me ask you something. Why are you here? Why are you searching for answers about someone who pulled away? You already know what happened. They withdrew. They distanced themselves. And now you're wondering, what are they hoping for when you go no contact? I'll tell you exactly what they're hoping for, and more importantly, I'll tell you what you need to do about it. When you go no contact with an avoidant, their initial response is often relief. That can be a hard truth to accept, but understanding why is the first step in breaking free from the cycle. Avoidants are wired to feel overwhelmed by intimacy and closeness. It's not about you, it's about their deep-seated need for emotional space. Their nervous system is conditioned to view closeness as a threat. When things start to feel too intimate, their defense mechanisms kick in. That's when they withdraw, shut down, or create distance. So when you pull away and go no contact, their first reaction is to exhale. They might even feel like they dodged a bullet. This isn't because they don't care, but because the intensity of emotions, both theirs and yours, has suddenly been turned down. It's like someone who's been carrying a heavy weight finally setting it down. That pressure they felt from the relationship, whether real or imagined, is temporarily lifted. This is why they seem unaffected at first. They may not even reach out. They may act as if nothing happened. But here's where it gets interesting. That relief, it doesn't last forever. It's a short-term fix to a long-term pattern. Avoidants don't just run from intimacy, they also crave connection, just on their own terms. Once they've had their space, something shifts. They start to wonder about you, they replay memories, they think about the connection, and they start to feel something they weren't expecting, discomfort. The avoidant mind works in cycles. When they're too close, they need distance. But when they've had distance, they start to feel the absence of what they pushed away. This can take days, weeks, or even months. But eventually the reality sets in. The relief they felt wasn't about escaping you. It was about escaping their own emotions. And those emotions don't just disappear. At this point, many avoidants will begin to test the waters. They might not come running back with open arms, but they'll send a text, watch your stories like a post, small breadcrumbs to see if you're still available. They don't want to dive back in, but they don't want to feel like they lost you either. This is why staying no contact is so powerful. It forces them to sit with the space they thought they wanted. It makes them realize that relief was just an illusion, a temporary escape from facing something real. Your job is not to relieve them of that discomfort. Your job is to recognize that their initial reaction is just that, a reaction. It's not proof they don't care. It's not proof you weren't enough. It's simply a defense mechanism, one that will only change if they choose to do the inner work. And you're not here to wait for that. You're here to step into your own strength, knowing that their temporary relief has nothing to do with your worth. When an avoidant pulls away, they don't necessarily want you to disappear. In fact, a big part of them hopes you won't. They want space, but they also want reassurance. They fear closeness, but they also fear being forgotten. It's a contradiction, but it's exactly how their attachment style works. They push you away to create emotional distance, but deep down they expect you to chase after them, to prove that your love is strong enough to overcome their avoidance. This cycle is familiar to them. It's what they've been conditioned to expect in relationships. As soon as things get too close, their instinct is to withdraw, believing that space will bring relief. But if you chase, they feel validated. They tell themselves, see, this person does care. They won't leave me. That validation gives them a sense of control. It allows them to feel wanted without having to fully commit. They get the comfort of knowing you're still there, waiting, hoping, and trying to bridge the gap they created. This is why avoidants often test the waters after pulling away. They want to see if you'll reach out first, if you'll fight for them, if you'll try to fix things. They may not come right out and ask for reassurance, but they leave little openings, maybe a vague text, a like on social media, or a question that doesn't require real engagement. These small actions aren't about rekindling the relationship. They're about making sure they haven't lost their hold on you. But here's the thing, chasing an avoidant only reinforces their pattern. The more you chase, the more they confirm their belief that love means losing their independence. It feeds their fear that relationships are suffocating. Instead of making them feel safe enough to come closer, it just pushes them further away. They retreat again, knowing they can come back whenever they want, because you'll always be there. When you break this cycle and go no contact, it disrupts their expectations. They start to realize something is different. You're not following the script. You're not giving them the chase they assumed would happen. This shift forces them to sit with their own feelings instead of relying on your pursuit for validation. It creates space, not just for them, but for you, to see the relationship clearly. Many avoidants don't expect people to truly leave. They assume you'll always be orbiting in some way. They assume they can return on their terms. But when you stop chasing, you break that assumption, and in that silence, they are left with a reality they weren't prepared for. The possibility that they miscalculated, that you aren't waiting in the wings, that this time they actually have to face what they've been avoiding. Avoidants are experts at avoiding responsibility, not just in relationships, but in the way they process emotions. When they pull away, they don't see it as abandoning the relationship. They see it as protecting themselves. They frame it in a way that justifies their actions. It just wasn't working. I wasn't ready, or we were too different. They tell themselves whatever they need to in order to avoid confronting their own role in what happened. This is why no contact is so powerful. It removes the opportunity for them to rewrite history in a way that makes them comfortable. When you go no contact, they can no longer rely on your reactions, your pleas, or your explanations to shift the narrative in their favor. They don't get to hear you say, "I still love you," or "I'll wait for you." They don't get to see you reaching out, which means they are left alone with their own thought. In that silence, that's where accountability starts to creep in. But in the short term, an avoidant hopes that time will erase the need for them to reflect. They assume that as time passes, emotions will settle and the breakup will just be another faded memory. They hope that the pain they might have caused will simply dissolve, that by doing nothing, the issue will resolve itself. They expect that either you'll move on quietly or you'll return on your own, allowing them to bypass any real self-examination. This is a defense mechanism they've built over time. Avoidants have often learned that emotions are overwhelming, so they minimize them. If something feels too intense, they disconnect from it. They rationalize it, suppress it, and move forward without processing. If they can convince themselves that time alone is the solution, they don't have to face their fears, their wounds, or the ways they might have contributed to the relationship's end. But here's the truth. Time doesn't erase responsibility, it only delays it. And while they may not acknowledge it outwardly, an avoidant does at some point feel the weight of their own choices. It might not happen right away, and it might not happen in a dramatic way, but the realization does come. Maybe they notice that their avoidance patterns follow them into every relationship. Maybe they see someone else loving the way you love them and they realize what they lost. Maybe they assume they'll always have time to return, only to find that you've moved on completely. Your role in this is not to wait for them to get there. It's not to prove anything to them or to force them to take responsibility. It's to recognize that their avoidance of accountability is a reflection of where they are in their own journey. You don't need to carry their unprocessed emotions. You don't need to hold space for someone who refuses to step up. What you need to do is stand firm in your decision to remove yourself from a dynamic that was never going to be fair to you. When you go no contact and refuse to engage in their cycle, you disrupt the easy way out they were hoping for. You remind them that relationships require more than just showing up when it's convenient. You show them without words that time doesn't erase the truth, it only reveals it. Avoidants thrive on control even if they don't realize it. They control the pace of the relationship, the level of intimacy, and most importantly, the emotional distance. They do this not out of malice, but as a way to protect themselves from the vulnerability that deep connection requires. When they withdraw, they expect to dictate the terms of how the relationship unfolds. When they engage, when they pull back, and when they decide to return, this control gives them a sense of security. As long as they are the ones managing the closeness, they don't have to face the discomfort of emotional unpredictability. They get to keep their independence while still maintaining a connection on their terms. They believe they have the upper hand because they assume that you, like others before, will follow the pattern, waiting, reaching out, and trying to bridge the gap they created. But when you go no contact, you disrupt that control. You take back your power by refusing to play by their rules. Suddenly, they're not the ones deciding the terms of engagement. You are. The silence they once saw as relief begins to feel like something else entirely, a shift in power. This is unsettling for an avoidant because they are used to being the ones who set the emotional temperature of the relationship. When you remove yourself from their dynamic, they lose the ability to predict your next move. They can't anticipate whether you'll reach out, whether you'll wait, or whether you've completely moved on. And for someone who finds comfort in control, that uncertainty is uncomfortable. At first, they may not react. They may even convince themselves that this is what they wanted all along: space, freedom, emotional distance. But over time, something changes. They start to wonder why you haven't reached out. They start to feel the absence of the control they once had. They realize that the option they assumed would always be available, reconnecting on their terms, is no longer guaranteed. This is where no contact becomes truly powerful. By refusing to chase, by refusing to break the silence, you force them to sit with the consequences of their choices. They have to confront the reality that relationships aren't one-sided. They have to face the fact that they can't just retreat and expect the other person to do the work of keeping the connection alive. For some avoidants, this can be a wake-up call. It may be the first time they truly recognize the impact of their avoidance patterns. But for others, it may only reinforce their need for control, leading them to double down on their emotional defenses. And that's the moment you gain the most clarity, because whether they return or not, you've already won. You've broken free from the cycle. You've chosen self-respect over waiting for someone who only engages on their terms. When you go no contact, you take control of what you can control, yourself, your emotions, your boundaries, your healing. You stop waiting for them to decide when and how they'll return, and instead you decide what's best for you. And that is the kind of power they never expected you to take back. Avoidants operate under a deeply ingrained belief that people don't truly leave them. They expect distance, but they don't expect finality. This belief stems from their own fears and attachment style. They assume that even if they push someone away, that person will still be there waiting in the background, ready to re-engage whenever the avoidant decides it's safe to return. It's not necessarily arrogance. It's a subconscious expectation shaped by past experiences where others have tried to pull them closer even after they created distance. When you go no contact, they assume it's temporary. They think you'll take a break, sit with your emotions, and eventually come back in some form, whether that's through a message, a social media interaction, or just keeping an open emotional door for them. This is why avoidants don't always rush to reconnect. They believe they have time. They assume you'll still be emotionally invested, still thinking about them, still waiting for a moment when they feel ready. This expectation exists because in many cases, avoidants have experienced people chasing after them. They've seen partners try to fix things, send long messages, ask for closure, or keep the door open in subtle ways. It reinforces their belief that emotional availability is always within reach, even when they withdraw. They believe they can return on their own terms without having to acknowledge the impact of their absence. But what happens when you don't wait? What happens when you actually move forward, not as a strategy, but as a genuine decision to choose yourself? That's when the dynamic shifts. Avoidants are comfortable when they know someone is still emotionally tied to them, even from a distance. The real discomfort begins when they sense that the connection they once took for granted is truly slipping away. At first, they may rationalize your silence. They might think they're just hurt, they'll come back eventually. They might even assume that your no contact period is just a phase, part of an emotional cycle they've seen before. But as time passes and you remain absent, a different realization starts to set in. They start to wonder if they miscalculated, if they assume too much, if this time you're not just waiting in the background. This realization can be unsettling for an avoidant because it forces them to confront something they've spent a lifetime avoiding. Loss. The idea that you, someone who once deeply cared, are no longer there in the way they expected, challenges their perception of control and connection. They start to replay memories, moments, and words exchanged. They might begin to feel the absence more intensely than they expected. The moment you stop waiting is the moment you break free. It's the moment you stop measuring your worth based on someone else's ability to commit. Because you deserve a love that is present, consistent, and reciprocal. And that kind of love doesn't require waiting, it requires choosing every single day. Avoidants have spent a lifetime believing that their emotional distance isn't a big deal. They assume that because they've learned to suppress their emotions, others will simply adapt to their way of functioning. They expect that their absence, whether physical or emotional, won't create a significant impact because in their mind, relationships operate on a low emotional basis. But when you go no contact, something happens that they weren't prepared for. You actually notice their absence and refuse to fill in the gaps. They are used to partners overcompensating for their emotional withdrawal, trying harder to bridge the emotional void they create. But when you stop doing that, when you remove yourself entirely, they are left with something deeply unsettling, the realization that their presence did matter and their absence does have consequences. This is when avoidants start to feel something they are not comfortable with, emotional responsibility. They may begin to wonder, did I misjudge this? Did I actually matter more than I thought? And that discomfort is powerful because it forces them to confront a reality they've always tried to avoid. Relationships require effort, and emotional absence is felt whether they acknowledge it or not. Avoidants often assume that the problem in relationships is external, that the dynamic wasn't right, that the timing was off, or that the other person simply wanted too much. This belief allows them to avoid looking inward. They move from one relationship to the next, repeating the same patterns while convincing themselves that they just haven't found the right situation. But when you go no contact, especially if you were someone who truly valued and cared for them, it creates a break in their cycle. They don't get the closure they expect, and they don't get the comfort of knowing you're still emotionally available in the background. This forces them to sit with an unfamiliar feeling, self-reflection. Over time, they may begin to wonder why this keeps happening. Why do they always end up feeling disconnected? Why do they keep losing people who genuinely cared for them? No contact isn't about making them change. It's about removing yourself from a cycle that isn't yours to fix. And in doing so, you create the space for them to either continue avoiding or, for the first time, face their own patterns. The key is this: you are not responsible for their growth. If they choose to do the work, that's on them. If they don't, that's also on them. Your job is to recognize that your value does not depend on someone else's ability to appreciate it. You don't lose by walking away. You win by refusing to stay where you are undervalued. Avoidants are not completely disconnected from their emotions. They just don't engage with them in a healthy way. When they sense that you are slipping away, they often throw out small signals to keep you tethered. A vague text, a like on social media, a random check-in. None of it means they are ready to fully commit, but it keeps you emotionally invested just enough to stay within reach. They hope you'll take these small gestures as signs of care. They hope you'll settle for the occasional interaction instead of the deep emotional connection you deserve. They rely on your past attachment to keep you engaged, even when they have no intention of showing up fully. Going no contact takes away their ability to breadcrumb you. It forces them to see that small efforts won't be enough to keep you in their life. It shifts the dynamic from them having control over when and how they engage to you deciding that half-hearted love isn't worth your time. When you stop accepting breadcrumbs, they are left with a choice: step up or lose you completely. And that's when they truly begin to feel the weight of what they've lost. Thank you for showing up for yourself today. Thank you for having the courage to step out of a cycle that no longer serves you. Thank you for choosing healing over attachment, self-respect over waiting, and clarity over confusion. Your time, your energy, and your heart are too valuable to be spent on someone who can't meet you where you are. So keep moving forward. Keep trusting that what's meant for you will never require you to beg, chase, or convince.